Dr. Sarah Chan had always prided herself on being prepared for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that erupted on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning. The emergency broadcast crackled through her car radio as she drove to the research facility where she worked as a microbiologist. Reports of violent incidents were flooding in from major cities across the country, each more disturbing than the last. The first sign something was catastrophically wrong came when Sarah noticed the unusual silence at the Meridian Research Institute. The parking lot, normally bustling with early morning arrivals, sat eerily empty except for a handful of abandoned vehicles with their doors flung wide open. One car's engine was still running, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like ghostly beacons. Sarah's training kicked in as she observed the scene with scientific detachment, noting the scattered personal belongings and the dark stains on the asphalt that looked suspiciously like blood. Inside the facility, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the sterile corridors. Sarah's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence as she made her way to the main laboratory. The security desk sat abandoned, the guard's coffee still steaming in its mug, a half-eaten donut beside it. The security monitors displayed feeds from around the building, but what Sarah saw on those screens made her blood run cold. On monitor 3, she watched as Dr. Marcus Webb, her colleague and friend, stumbled through the basement corridor with an unnatural, jerky gait. His lab coat was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled beyond recognition. But it was his face that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes had lost all traces of the intelligence and warmth she remembered. When he turned toward the camera, his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained dark red. The emergency broadcast continued its litany of horror stories, each report more desperate than the last. Cities were falling into chaos, hospitals were overwhelmed, and authorities were urging people to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone showing signs of aggressive behavior or unusual symptoms. The words unknown pathogen and rapid transmission repeated like a deadly mantra through the static-filled announcements. Sarah's phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from her sister Emma, who lived 30 miles away in the suburbs with her 2 young children. The messages painted a terrifying picture of their quiet neighborhood descending into madness. Neighbors who had waved hello just yesterday were now attacking anyone who came near their property. Emma's last message was barely coherent: "Sarah, they're not human anymore." Mike tried to help Mrs. Patterson, and God, she bit him. He's changing too. The kids are scared. What do I do? The facility's intercom system suddenly crackled to life, but instead of the usual professional announcements, it carried the sound of screaming and what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah realized with growing horror that she might not be alone in the building after all. The emergency lockdown protocols she had helped design were meant to contain biological hazards, but they were also keeping her trapped inside with whatever Dr. Webb had become. As Sarah gathered her thoughts and tried to formulate a plan, she began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a local incident or even a national crisis. The radio reports mentioned similar outbreaks occurring simultaneously around the globe. Whatever had caused this transformation was spreading faster than any disease she had ever studied, and it was changing people into something that could barely be called human. The sound of shuffling footsteps in the corridor outside the security office made Sarah's decision for her. She grabbed the security guard's radio, stuffed emergency supplies from the first aid kit into her backpack, and headed for the rear exit. The service tunnels beneath the facility would provide a safer route to her car than the main corridors, where more transformed individuals might be wandering. As she descended into the underground passages, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing the end of the world as she knew it. The comfortable predictability of her life as a scientist had evaporated in a matter of hours, replaced by a nightmare scenario that seemed ripped from the pages of a horror novel. But Sarah was a survivor, and more importantly, she was a problem solver. Somewhere out there, her sister and countless others were depending on people like her to find answers. The tunnels stretched ahead into darkness, and Sarah steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. The world above was breaking apart, but through those very cracks, she hoped to find her way to the people who mattered most. The service tunnels beneath the Meridian Research Institute stretched like concrete arteries through the earth, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast long, ominous shadows on the walls. Sarah moved carefully through the underground passages, her footsteps muffled by the rubber soles of her laboratory shoes. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and something else she couldn't quite identify, a metallic scent that reminded her uncomfortably of the laboratory where she had spent countless hours studying blood samples. The radio in her hand crackled with sporadic transmissions from emergency services, but each report painted a bleaker picture than the last. The National Guard had been deployed to major population centers, but their communications suggested they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to multiply faster than they could contain it. Sarah adjusted the volume to barely audible, knowing that any sound could attract unwanted attention in these echoing tunnels. 30 minutes into her underground journey, Sarah encountered her first obstacle. The tunnel ahead was partially collapsed, forcing her to take a detour through a maintenance area she had never seen before. As she climbed through the debris, her flashlight beam caught something that made her freeze in terror. Dr. Marcus Webb stood at the far end of the tunnel, swaying slightly as if he were listening for something. His transformation was complete now, his skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface like a grotesque roadmap of decay. Sarah held her breath and slowly backed away, but her movement dislodged a small piece of concrete that clattered to the floor. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound with inhuman speed, and Sarah found herself staring into eyes that held no recognition, no humanity, only an endless, predatory hunger. He began moving toward her with that same jerky, unnatural gait she had observed on the security monitors, but his speed was alarming. Whatever had taken control of Marcus's body had enhanced his physical capabilities in disturbing ways. Running now, Sarah navigated the labyrinth of maintenance tunnels by instinct and emergency lighting. Behind her, she could hear Marcus's pursuit, not just his footsteps, but a low, guttural sound that was neither human speech nor animal growling. The sound echoed through the tunnels, and Sarah realized with growing horror that it might be attracting others. The facility's security protocols had sealed the building, but they had also trapped whatever was inside with her. The tunnel system eventually led to an emergency exit that opened into the facility's loading dock. Sarah emerged into daylight to find a world transformed beyond recognition. The parking lot that had seemed eerily quiet earlier was now a scene of absolute chaos. Abandoned vehicles sat with their doors open, personal belongings scattered across the asphalt like the remnants of interrupted lives. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the city, and the sound of sirens carried on the wind, though they seemed to be growing fewer and more distant. Sarah's car was still where she had left it, but getting to it meant crossing 50 yards of open ground where she would be completely exposed. As she watched from the loading dock, she saw movement among the abandoned vehicles. 3 figures emerged from behind an overturned delivery truck, moving with that same disturbing gait she had observed in Marcus. They were dressed in the clothes they had worn to work that morning, a security guard, a maintenance worker, and someone in a business suit, but their humanity had been stripped away, leaving only predatory shells driven by an insatiable hunger. The infected individuals moved with purpose, following some invisible trail that led them directly toward the loading dock where Sarah was hiding. She realized they could somehow sense her presence, perhaps through smell or body heat or some other mechanism she didn't yet understand. Her scientific mind cataloged these observations even as her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Sarah waited until the infected had moved past her position before making her desperate sprint to the car. The 30 seconds it took to reach her vehicle felt like an eternity, every step expecting to feel teeth or claws tearing into her back. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking from adrenaline, before finally getting the engine started. As she drove away from the facility, Sarah caught one last glimpse in her rearview mirror of Dr. Marcus Webb emerging from the building's main entrance. He stood motionless for a moment, as if sensing her departure, before turning back toward the building where others might still be trapped. The radio continued its litany of disaster reports as Sarah navigated the increasingly chaotic streets toward her sister's neighborhood. She had survived her first encounter with the infected, but she knew this was only the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous journey. The suburban streets that Sarah had driven through countless times over the years were now a maze of abandoned vehicles and debris. Overturned cars blocked intersections, their contents spilled across the asphalt like the remnants of interrupted escapes. She navigated carefully around a school bus that had crashed into a telephone pole, its yellow paint stark against the gray morning sky. Through the broken windows, she could see small backpacks and lunch boxes scattered across the seats, silent testimony to the children who would never make it to class that day. Sarah's phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, cutting off her connection to Emma's increasingly desperate messages. The last text she had received simply read, "Basement. Can't get out. They're upstairs." The timestamp showed it had been sent over an hour ago, and Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator despite the dangerous road conditions. Every minute that passed reduced the chances that her sister and the children were still alive. As she turned onto Maple Street, just 3 blocks from Emma's house, Sarah encountered her first group of living survivors. A barricade of shopping carts, lawn furniture, and car parts blocked the road ahead, and 3 people emerged from behind the makeshift barrier with weapons drawn. The leader, a middle-aged man in paint-stained work clothes, approached her car with a baseball bat held ready to strike. "Stop right there," he shouted through her windshield. "Turn around and go back the way you came. This neighborhood is protected." Sarah rolled down her window slowly, keeping her hands visible. "I'm not infected," she called out. "My sister lives on Oak Street. I'm trying to reach her and her children." The man studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the transformation they had all learned to fear. Behind him, Sarah could see the other 2 survivors, a teenage girl holding a kitchen knife and an elderly woman clutching a crowbar with surprising determination. Their eyes held the haunted look of people who had seen too much in too short a time. "Oak Street's compromised," the man said, lowering his bat slightly. "The infected broke through the barriers there about 2 hours ago. We tried to help, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Most folks either got out or they didn't. I'm sorry." Sarah felt her heart sink, but she refused to give up hope. "I have to try. She's all the family I have left." The teenage girl stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "There might be another way. My name's Riley, and I know these streets better than anyone. There's a path through the backyards that might get you to Oak Street without going through the main infected areas. But you can't go alone." The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Martinez, nodded in agreement. "Riley's right. We've learned that traveling in groups is the only way to survive. The infected seem to hunt in packs now, but they get confused when they encounter multiple targets moving in coordination." The man, who went by Tom, examined Sarah's car with a practical eye. "Your vehicle's too loud and conspicuous for what Riley's suggesting. But we've been planning to move our group to a more secure location anyway. If you're willing to help us gather our supplies and people, we'll help you reach your sister." Sarah didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, Sarah found herself part of an improvised rescue operation. The group had established a network of safe houses throughout the neighborhood, connected by a system of signals and predetermined meeting points. They moved through backyards and between houses, avoiding the main streets where the infected tended to congregate in larger numbers. During their cautious journey, Sarah learned more about how the outbreak had progressed. Tom had been a construction foreman before the world changed, and his practical knowledge of the neighborhood's layout had kept his group alive. Riley was a high school student whose quick thinking and intimate knowledge of every shortcut and hiding spot had saved multiple families. Mrs. Martinez had been a nurse for 40 years, and her medical knowledge had proven invaluable in treating injuries and recognizing the early signs of infection. Together, they had developed survival strategies that went beyond simply hiding. They had learned to move silently, to communicate through hand signals, and to identify the behavioral patterns of the infected. Most importantly, they had learned to trust each other completely, a trust that had been forged in the crucible of shared terror and mutual dependence. As they approached the final stretch toward Oak Street, Sarah realized that she was no longer just a lone scientist trying to reach her family. She had become part of something larger, a community of survivors who had found strength in their unity. The world might be falling apart, but through the cracks of that broken civilization, people were finding each other. The sight of Emma's house in the distance brought both hope and fear. Smoke was rising from several buildings on the street, and the silence was ominous. But Sarah was no longer facing this nightmare alone. Emma's house stood silent at the end of Oak Street, its white picket fence now broken and splattered with dark stains that Sarah tried not to examine too closely. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze, and children's toys were scattered across the front yard as if they had been abandoned mid-play. Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the house with her new companions, each step feeling like it might be leading her toward devastating news about her sister and nephews. Tom held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop at the edge of the property. His construction experience had taught him to assess structural integrity, but now he applied those same observational skills to evaluating danger. "Something's not right," he whispered, pointing to the upstairs windows. "Look at the curtains. They're moving, but there's no wind up there." Riley crouched behind the mailbox, her teenage eyes sharp and alert. "I can see scratch marks on the door frame," she reported quietly. "And there's broken glass on the porch that looks fresh. Whatever happened here, it happened recently." Mrs. Martinez knelt beside a flower bed near the front steps, her nursing background making her notice details others might miss. "There's blood here, but it's been cleaned up hastily. Someone tried to wash it away with a garden hose." She pointed to water stains on the concrete and diluted red streaks leading toward the back of the house. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The fact that someone had tried to clean up suggested that Emma might have survived the initial attack, but the evidence of violence was undeniable. She moved toward the front door, but Tom caught her arm gently. "We go in together, and we go in smart," he said firmly. "If your sister is in there, we'll find her. But if those things are in there instead, we need to be ready." The group entered the house with practiced caution, using hand signals they had developed during their time together. The living room showed signs of a desperate struggle: overturned furniture, broken picture frames, and scratch marks on the walls that looked like they had been made by human fingernails. Emma's family photos lay scattered across the floor, their smiling faces now seeming like artifacts from a different world entirely. The kitchen told a different story. Someone had clearly attempted to barricade the back door using chairs, a table, and anything else they could find. Empty food containers suggested that people had been hiding here for an extended period, rationing their supplies carefully. Sarah found a note taped to the refrigerator in Emma's handwriting: "If anyone finds this, we've gone to the school." The basement flooded. "Tommy is hurt but walking. We heard radio broadcast about evacuation center." Relief flooded through Sarah as she shared the note with her companions. Emma and the children were alive, or at least they had been when they left this message. But their relief was short-lived when they heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs above them, slow, deliberate footsteps that definitely weren't trying to remain quiet. "We need to leave now," Tom whispered urgently, but before they could move toward the exit, a figure appeared at the top of the staircase. It had once been Emma's neighbor Mr. Peterson, a retired accountant who had always waved cheerfully from his garden. Now his business casual clothes were torn and stained, his skin had taken on that familiar grayish pallor, and his eyes held no recognition of the people standing in his neighbor's kitchen. The infected man began descending the stairs with increasing speed, and behind him, they could hear more movement, at least 2 or 3 other infected individuals who had been drawn by their voices. The house that had seemed like a potential sanctuary was actually a trap, and the group found themselves surrounded with limited escape routes. Riley pointed toward the back door, but the barricade Emma had constructed would take precious time to dismantle. Mrs. Martinez noticed a basement door near the pantry, but they had no idea what might be waiting in the darkness below. Tom hefted his baseball bat, preparing to clear a path through the infected, but the odds were stacked against them. Sarah made a split-second decision that drew on her scientific training and her newfound understanding of group survival. "The window over the sink," she said quietly. "It opens onto the side yard where Emma's kids used to play. We can reach the neighbor's fence from there." As Mr. Peterson reached the bottom of the stairs and more infected figures appeared behind him, the group moved as one toward their improvised escape route. They had found Emma's message, but now they faced the challenge of staying alive long enough to follow her trail to the school evacuation center. The safe house had become a death trap, but their bond as a group had given them options they wouldn't have had alone. The escape through Emma's kitchen window had been chaotic but successful, leaving the group crouched behind a garden shed in the neighboring yard while infected figures stumbled around the house they had just fled. Sarah's hands were still shaking from the adrenaline as she examined the cuts on her arms from broken glass, but Mrs. Martinez was already tending to everyone's minor wounds with supplies from her improvised medical kit. "That was too close," Tom muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "We're getting sloppy. In the early days, we would have checked that house more thoroughly before going inside." Riley nodded in agreement, her teenage bravado replaced by the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned to survive in a world gone mad. "The infected are getting smarter, or at least more organized. Did you notice how they were positioned throughout the house? It was almost like they were waiting for us." As they caught their breath and planned their next move, Sarah began to understand that survival in this new world required skills that no amount of scientific training had prepared her for. Over the next several hours, as they made their way toward Riverside Elementary School where Emma's note indicated the evacuation center was located, her companions taught her lessons that would mean the difference between life and death. Tom showed her how to move silently through different types of terrain. "Avoid gravel and dry leaves when possible," he explained as they navigated through a residential area. "Glass and metal make noise that carries further than you think. And always test your footing before putting your full weight down." His construction background had given him an intuitive understanding of how sound traveled through different materials and structures. Mrs. Martinez taught Sarah to read the signs of infection progression. "The gray skin and loss of coordination happen first," she explained quietly as they observed a group of infected wandering aimlessly in a parking lot. "But notice how some of them move differently than others. The fresher ones are faster and more aggressive. The older ones seem to be deteriorating physically, but they're also more persistent in tracking prey." Riley's contribution was perhaps the most valuable of all. She taught Sarah how to think like a survivor rather than a victim. "Stop thinking about what you've lost," the teenager said as they rested in an abandoned convenience store. "Start thinking about what you can use. That broken mirror isn't just debris, it's a signaling device and a way to see around corners. Those empty soda bottles aren't trash, they're noisemakers you can throw to distract the infected." As they made their way through the suburban landscape, the group encountered other survivors, some friendly and others decidedly hostile. At a gas station, they met a family of 4 who had been traveling for days without finding any safe refuge. The parents were exhausted and their young children were hungry and frightened. Without hesitation, Mrs. Martinez shared some of their limited food supplies, while Tom helped the father reinforce their vehicle for better protection. But not all encounters were positive. At a roadblock near the school, they were confronted by a group of armed survivors who demanded payment in supplies or ammunition for safe passage through their territory. The leader, a man with cold eyes and military bearing, made it clear that the rules of civilized society no longer applied in his domain. "You've got a choice," the man told them, his rifle pointed casually in their direction. "Pay the toll, or find another way around. And trust me, there is no other way around that doesn't go through infected territory." Sarah watched as Tom assessed the situation with the same careful attention he had applied to construction problems in his previous life. Rather than escalate the confrontation, he negotiated diplomatically, trading some of their medical supplies for passage and information about the school's current status. "The evacuation center got overrun 3 days ago," the roadblock leader informed them after completing the transaction. "Military pulled out yesterday morning. Anyone who was there either got out or didn't. But there's rumors of a new safe zone being established at the old Blackwood Mall, about 15 miles north." As they continued toward the school, now knowing it might be another dead end, Sarah reflected on how much she had learned in just one day. Survival wasn't just about avoiding the infected, it was about reading people, managing resources, making split-second decisions, and maintaining hope in the face of constantly shifting circumstances. The group had evolved from a collection of strangers into a functioning unit, each member contributing their unique skills to their collective survival. Tom's practical knowledge, Mrs. Martinez's medical expertise, Riley's adaptability, and Sarah's analytical thinking had combined to create something stronger than any of them could have been alone. As Riverside Elementary School came into view, its empty playground and broken windows telling their own story of tragedy, Sarah realized that finding Emma was only part of her mission now. She had found a new family in these survivors, and protecting them had become just as important as reuniting with her sister. Riverside Elementary School stood like a monument to shattered dreams, its cheerful murals now marred by dark stains and broken windows. The playground equipment that had once echoed with children's laughter sat empty and twisted, some pieces clearly damaged in whatever violent confrontation had taken place here. Sarah approached the main entrance with her heart in her throat, knowing that each step might bring news that would either reunite her with Emma or confirm her worst fears. The school's main hallway was littered with abandoned belongings, suitcases, backpacks, and personal items that told the story of families who had arrived seeking safety but found only chaos. Emergency supply stations had been hastily established in the gymnasium and cafeteria, but they now sat empty except for scattered canned goods and medical supplies that had been deemed too damaged or expired to take. Riley discovered a bulletin board near the principal's office where survivors had left messages for missing family members. The notes were heartbreaking in their desperate hope, parents searching for children, spouses trying to reconnect, friends hoping against hope that their loved ones had somehow made it to safety. Sarah scanned each message carefully, and her breath caught when she found Emma's distinctive handwriting. "Sarah, if you find this, we made it out alive. Tommy's leg is getting worse, but he's brave. We joined a group heading to Blackwood Mall. Look for us there. The leader's name is Captain Rodriguez. He says they have doctors. We left on June 22nd at dawn. I love you. Emma." The date on the note was yesterday, which meant Emma and the children were only 24 hours ahead of them. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but Mrs. Martinez's expression was troubled as she examined some of the medical supplies left behind in the school's makeshift infirmary. "These antibiotics have been opened and partially used," the elderly nurse observed, holding up several medicine bottles. "Someone here had a serious infection, and they needed strong medication to fight it. The fact that these were left behind suggests either they recovered enough to travel, or..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Tom was examining the physical evidence of what had happened at the school. "The damage patterns suggest this wasn't an infected attack," he concluded after studying broken doors and overturned furniture. "This was human-on-human violence. People fighting over resources, probably when supplies started running low." As they prepared to leave the school and head toward Blackwood Mall, the group was approached by a lone survivor who had been hiding in the building's basement. Marcus Thompson was a teacher who had been at the school when the evacuation center was established, and his account of what had transpired there shook Sarah to her core. "It started out well enough," Marcus explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion and trauma. "We had maybe 200 people here at the peak. Captain Rodriguez's military group was keeping order, distributing supplies, treating the wounded. But resources were limited, and tough decisions had to be made." He described how the situation deteriorated as supplies dwindled and infected breaches became more frequent. Families were forced to choose between staying and hoping for government rescue or venturing out into the dangerous world beyond the school's walls. The final straw came when some survivors accused others of hoarding supplies, leading to violence that tore the community apart. "Your sister's group left with Captain Rodriguez's convoy," Marcus continued. "But there were others who thought Rodriguez was playing favorites, giving better treatment to some families than others. A faction broke away and headed east toward the river. There was fighting. People died, Sarah. Good people who had survived everything the infected threw at them, only to be killed by other survivors." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the threat posed by the infected that she hadn't fully considered how dangerous other survivors could be. The breakdown of social order hadn't just created the problem of flesh-eating monsters, it had also stripped away the moral constraints that kept human beings from turning on each other. Riley, despite her youth, seemed to understand the implications better than anyone. "It's not just about finding your sister anymore," she said quietly. "It's about what kind of people we choose to be when everything falls apart. Are we going to be like the families who helped each other, or like the ones who fought over scraps?" Mrs. Martinez nodded gravely. "In my years as a nurse, I learned that crisis reveals character. Some people become heroes when everything goes wrong. Others become monsters, even without being infected." As they left the school and began their journey toward Blackwood Mall, Sarah realized that finding Emma was no longer just about family reunion. It had become a test of whether hope and human decency could survive in a world where survival often seemed to require abandoning both. The cost of hope, she was learning, might be higher than she had ever imagined. The journey to Blackwood Mall had taken the group through 15 miles of increasingly dangerous territory, where abandoned vehicles created maze-like obstacles and infected wandered in larger, more organized groups than they had encountered before. By the time they reached the mall's parking lot, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt that seemed to hide threats in every corner. Blackwood Mall had once been the pride of the suburban shopping district, but now it stood as a fortress against the apocalypse. The entrances had been barricaded with shopping carts, concrete barriers, and razor wire, while armed guards patrolled the upper levels, their silhouettes visible against the fading daylight. Smoke rose from several chimneys that had been improvised through the mall's roof, suggesting that a substantial community had established itself inside. As Sarah's group approached the main checkpoint, they were met by two guards who carried themselves with military precision. The lead guard, a woman with sergeant's stripes on her makeshift uniform, questioned them thoroughly about their origins, their health status, and their intentions. It was clear that this community had learned hard lessons about screening newcomers. "Captain Rodriguez is selective about who gets admitted," the sergeant explained. "We've got limited resources and we can't take in everyone who shows up. You'll need to prove you can contribute something valuable to the community, and you'll submit to a full medical examination to ensure you're not infected or carrying any diseases." The screening process took over an hour, during which Sarah found herself separated from her companions for individual interviews. The questions were probing and sometimes uncomfortable, clearly designed to identify potential troublemakers or security risks. When asked about her scientific background, Sarah sensed increased interest from the interviewers, suggesting that her expertise might be exactly what this community needed. Finally, they were escorted into the mall's main concourse, where Sarah got her first glimpse of what organized survival could look like. The former retail space had been transformed into a functioning town, with living areas established in former storefronts, a medical clinic set up in what used to be a department store, and communal areas where children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. The sight that made Sarah's heart race was a familiar figure sitting near the makeshift medical clinic, Emma, thinner than she remembered and with worry lines that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably alive. Beside her sat two young boys, Sarah's nephews Tommy and Jake, who looked tired but healthy. Tommy's leg was wrapped in professional-looking bandages, suggesting he had received proper medical care. The reunion was everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Emma's tears of joy matched her own as they embraced for the first time since the world had changed forever. The boys, who had grown closer to their aunt during family gatherings over the years, clung to her with the desperate relief of children who had seen too much uncertainty. But their joy was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez himself, a man whose bearing and demeanor immediately commanded attention. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of calm confidence that came from successfully leading people through impossible situations. However, there was something in his eyes that made Sarah uneasy, a calculating coldness that suggested he viewed every interaction through the lens of strategic advantage. "Dr. Chen," he said, having clearly been briefed on her background. "Your sister has told me about your expertise in microbiology. We've been hoping someone with your qualifications would find their way to us. We have a situation that requires immediate scientific attention." Rodriguez led them to the mall's former electronics store, which had been converted into a laboratory of sorts. Inside, Sarah found equipment that had obviously been salvaged from various medical facilities and research institutions. More disturbing were the isolation chambers that had been constructed in the back of the space, where several people lay unconscious or sedated. "We've been experimenting with potential treatments for the infection," Rodriguez explained. "These volunteers were bitten but showed unusual resistance to the transformation. We believe they might hold the key to developing a cure or at least a preventive treatment." Sarah's scientific instincts were immediately engaged, but her moral compass was troubled by what she was seeing. The volunteers appeared to be heavily sedated, and she noticed restraints on the examination tables that suggested these people might not have agreed to their current situation willingly. "I understand your concerns," Rodriguez continued, as if reading her thoughts. "But desperate times require desperate measures. We're fighting for the survival of humanity itself. Personal preferences and individual rights are luxuries we can no longer afford." The reunion Sarah had dreamed of was turning into a nightmare of moral complexity, where saving her family might require participating in activities that violated everything she believed about scientific ethics and human dignity. The confrontation with Captain Rodriguez came to a head 3 days after Sarah's arrival at Blackwood Mall, when she discovered that one of the volunteers in the medical experiments was actually Marcus Thompson, the teacher they had met at the school. He had arrived at the mall shortly after their group, but instead of being welcomed as a survivor, he had been detained and subjected to Rodriguez's research program without his consent. Sarah's scientific training had allowed her to quickly assess the captain's methods, and what she found horrified her. The experiments were not only unethical but also fundamentally flawed in their approach. Rodriguez was treating the infection like a conventional disease, applying treatments that had no basis in sound research methodology. Worse, he was falsifying results to maintain his authority and justify increasingly extreme measures. "You don't understand the bigger picture," Rodriguez argued when Sarah confronted him privately. "I've kept over 300 people alive in this facility. That requires making hard choices that people like you, with your academic ethics, simply can't comprehend. In the real world, moral purity is a death sentence." But Sarah had learned something crucial during her journey with Tom, Riley, and Mrs. Martinez, that survival didn't require abandoning humanity. Her companions had proven that people could maintain their moral compass even in the darkest circumstances, and that communities built on trust and mutual respect were stronger than those built on fear and authoritarian control. The breaking point came when Rodriguez announced his intention to expand the research program, requiring all new arrivals to participate in medical testing regardless of their consent. Emma, still recovering from her own traumatic experiences, begged Sarah not to make waves that might jeopardize their family's safety. The children needed stability, she argued, and Rodriguez's community was the closest thing to security they had found. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice: remain silent and complicit in activities that violated everything she believed in, or risk her family's safety by challenging the man who controlled their fate. The decision became clear when she discovered that Tommy, Emma's son, had been selected for the next round of testing due to his apparent immunity to infection from a previous bite. That night, Sarah gathered her original companions and shared her concerns. Tom's practical experience told him that communities built on coercion eventually collapsed from within. Riley's youthful idealism refused to accept that survival required becoming monsters. Mrs. Martinez's medical knowledge confirmed Sarah's assessment that Rodriguez's experiments were both useless and dangerous. Together, they developed a plan that would expose Rodriguez's failures while offering the mall community a better alternative. Sarah used her scientific credentials to call a general assembly, where she presented evidence of the captain's falsified research and proposed a new approach based on cooperation rather than control. The presentation sparked intense debate within the community. Many residents were frightened of change, having found relative safety under Rodriguez's leadership despite its moral costs. Others, particularly those who had lost family members to the captain's increasingly paranoid security measures, welcomed the opportunity for reform. The conflict was resolved not through violence but through the power of democratic choice, something Rodriguez had forgotten was possible in their new world. When the community voted to restructure their leadership and abandon the unethical research program, the captain chose to leave rather than adapt to the new system, taking a small group of loyal followers with him. Sarah found herself in a leadership position she had never sought, working with a council that included Tom, Mrs. Martinez, and several other experienced survivors to build a community based on different principles. They established transparent decision-making processes, ethical guidelines for medical treatment, and resource-sharing systems that prioritized the needs of children and elderly community members. The mall community began to thrive under this new approach, attracting other survivor groups who had heard about a place where people were treated with dignity and respect. Emma, initially fearful of the changes, gradually came to understand that her children would be safer in a community built on trust than in one ruled by fear. As weeks turned to months, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had begun as a lone scientist desperate to save her family, but through the cracks of a broken world, she had discovered something she hadn't expected, a new kind of family that extended far beyond blood relationships. The infected still posed a constant threat, and resources remained scarce, but the community had learned that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about preserving the qualities that made life worth living: compassion, integrity, hope, and the belief that people could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. Standing on the mall's upper level at sunset, watching children play in the courtyard below while adults worked together to maintain their shared home, Sarah understood that they had accomplished something remarkable. Through the cracks of a broken world, survivors had indeed found each other, and in finding each other, they had found themselves.